How well do you truly know the person you trust the most? We often believe that evil presents itself with a menacing snarl, a clear and present danger. But the most terrifying monsters are the ones who come bearing gifts, who speak with a silver tongue, and who wrap their victims in a warm embrace of charisma before the cold reality of their nature is revealed. This is a story about a man who perfected the art of the mask, a master puppeteer who pulled the strings of love, trust, and finance until his greatest prize simply vanished into thin air. On the crisp autumn morning of October 24th, 2019, the sprawling estate of Eleanor Vance was unusually quiet. Eleanor, the 58-year-old heiress to a vast manufacturing fortune, was a woman of meticulous routine. Her staff knew her schedule better than their own. Yet her bed had not been slept in, her morning tea was untouched, and her two prized Afghan hounds whined anxiously by the grand French doors. Her car was in the garage, her purse on the hall table, and her passport secured in its drawer. Eleanor Vance, a woman with the means to go anywhere in the world, had disappeared from the one place she should have been safest. The initial police response was one of cautious concern, not alarm. The lead investigators, Detective Harding, a grizzled veteran with an eye for detail, and his younger, more tech-savvy partner, Detective Chen, surveyed the scene. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no overturned furniture. Everything in the multi-million-dollar home was in its immaculate place. It was a crime scene devoid of any evidence of a crime, a silent testament to a person who was there one moment and gone the next. The mystery wasn't what had happened in the house. It was the utter lack of anything happening at all. The first person they interviewed was Julian Croft. Julian was Eleanor's partner of 2 years, a man whose charm was as legendary as Eleanor's wealth. He was an art consultant, impeccably dressed, articulate, and seemingly devastated. He told the detectives that Eleanor had been feeling overwhelmed and had spoken of getting away for a bit. He portrayed her as a flighty, emotionally fragile woman, a narrative that didn't quite match the shrewd businesswoman her friends knew. Julian was the picture of a concerned lover, yet Detective Harding felt a flicker of professional unease, a sense that the performance was just a little too polished. Julian Croft had entered Eleanor's life like a character from a novel. He'd met her at a charity art auction, dazzling her with his knowledge of impressionist painters and his disarming wit. He was younger, handsome, and showered her with an intoxicating level of attention she hadn't experienced in her lonely life as a widow. He isolated her, subtly and skillfully, from her lifelong friends, convincing her they were jealous of her newfound happiness or only interested in her money. He became her entire world, a carefully constructed universe of two, with him at its center. As days turned into a week, the investigation stalled. Eleanor's friends and family, when finally reached, all told a similar story. They described Julian as a godsend at first, the man who finally made Eleanor smile again. But they also spoke of a slow, creeping isolation. Phone calls went unreturned, lunch invitations were politely declined, and eventually, Eleanor, once a vibrant socialite, became a recluse in her own home. Julian had systematically cut every thread connecting her to her old life, leaving her tethered only to him. His control was absolute, yet he achieved it with whispers and smiles, not threats. Detective Chen began a deep dive into Julian Croft's past, and what he found was less of a history and more of a series of carefully curated stories. Julian claimed to have been educated in Europe, but no records existed. He spoke of a wealthy family, yet no such family could be found. What Chen did find was a pattern. 3 other wealthy, lonely women in the past 15 years had been romantically involved with Julian Croft. Each relationship had ended in a similar fashion, with Julian inheriting a substantial sum of money after his partner's sudden and tragic departure. The first was a socialite in Miami who had supposedly fallen from her yacht during a private cruise with Julian. Her body was never recovered. The second was a tech entrepreneur in Seattle who died from a sudden, aggressive illness, leaving Julian as the sole beneficiary of her will, which had been changed just weeks before her death. The third was a ranching heiress in Wyoming who had simply driven off one day and vanished. Her car found abandoned near a national park. In every case, Julian was the last person to see them alive, and in every case, the local authorities had found no evidence of foul play. Harding and Chen were now convinced they were dealing with a predator of a kind they had never encountered. This wasn't a common criminal. This was a phantom who moved through the lives of the wealthy, leaving a trail of broken hearts, empty bank accounts, and missing persons files that were cold to the touch. He was a ghost who knew how to erase not just his victims, but the very evidence of his own existence. He built his alibis out of the trust he cultivated, making his accusers seem paranoid and unstable. The detectives brought Julian in for another interview, this time with a more pointed line of questioning. They presented him with the stories of the other women. Julian's charming demeanor never wavered. He expressed profound sadness, portraying himself as the unluckiest man in the world, a man cursed to find love only to have it tragically ripped away. He painted each woman's demise as a terrible accident or a personal tragedy that had nothing to do with him. He was so convincing, so empathetic that for a moment, even Harding doubted his own gut instinct. Julian's power was in his ability to mirror people's desires. To the lonely, he was a constant companion. To the insecure, he was a source of endless validation. To Eleanor Vance, who secretly feared her wealth was her only attractive quality, he was the man who claimed to love her for her mind. He was a social chameleon, a void that took the shape of whatever his victims needed most. This made the investigation a psychological labyrinth. Every lead seemed to loop back to the perfect, caring image Julian had so masterfully constructed. The search for Eleanor Vance expanded. Her face was on every news channel, her name in every paper. The police scoured her estate again, bringing in forensic teams to search for a microscopic trace of blood, a single strand of hair, anything to suggest a struggle. They found nothing. The house was not just clean, it was sterile, as if someone had meticulously wiped away not just fingerprints, but the very essence of the woman who had lived there. Julian's control extended even to the physical space she had once occupied. Frustration mounted at the precinct. They had a prime suspect, a clear pattern of behavior, and a missing person who was almost certainly the victim of a crime, but they had no physical evidence. There was no body, no weapon, no confession. The case was a ghost, much like Julian himself. They were trying to build a murder case against a man who was, on paper and in the eyes of many, a grieving partner. The perfect crime wasn't one that was cleverly solved. It was one that nobody was even sure had happened. The breakthrough, when it came, was not from a dramatic discovery in a dark forest or a secret confession from a troubled accomplice. It came from the cold, emotionless world of numbers. Detective Chen, following a hunch, had enlisted a forensic accountant to perform a deep audit of Eleanor's and Julian's finances. For weeks, the accountant waded through a dizzying array of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and complex transactions designed to obscure the flow of money. It was a financial fortress built to be impenetrable. And then he found it. A single, seemingly insignificant purchase made 6 months before Eleanor's disappearance. A shell company, owned by another shell company that was ultimately traced back to Julian Croft, had purchased a remote, 10-acre plot of undeveloped land in rural East Texas. The land was scrub and forest, with no structures and no apparent value. It was bought with cash through a third-party lawyer, to ensure maximum anonymity. It was a purchase designed never to be found. On its own, the land purchase was suspicious, but not criminal. But there was a second transaction, made by the same shell company just 1 week later. It was for the rental of heavy-duty excavation equipment, including a backhoe. The rental period was for a single weekend, and the equipment was delivered to a location near the newly purchased land. Julian Croft, the sophisticated art consultant, had, for 1 weekend, become a man who needed to dig a very large hole in the middle of nowhere. Armed with this new information, Harding and Chen obtained a search warrant for the remote property. They arrived with a team of forensic anthropologists and ground-penetrating radar. For 2 days, they scanned the 10 acres of dense woodland. The radar showed multiple areas where the earth had been disturbed, but this was common in rural land. They needed to know where to dig. The property was a needle in a haystack, and Julian had been meticulous in covering his tracks, leaving no obvious markers. The lead anthropologist, a woman named Dr. Heiress, suggested a different approach. Instead of looking for a burial site, she told them to look for what was missing. She pointed out an area where a specific type of native plant was absent, while it grew plentifully everywhere else. She theorized that the soil here had been fundamentally changed, perhaps by a chemical agent that would kill the local flora. Following her instinct, the team began to dig in the barren patch of earth. They did not find Eleanor Vance. At a depth of 8 feet, their shovels hit a layer of something that wasn't soil. It was a dark chemical sludge. Samples were rushed to the lab, and the results were chilling. The soil was saturated with sodium hydroxide, commonly known as lye. It's a highly corrosive chemical capable of dissolving organic matter. Julian Croft hadn't buried Eleanor Vance's body. He had erased it, ensuring there would be no physical remains left to find. He had not just committed a murder, he had tried to unwrite a life. This was the linchpin of their case, but it was still entirely circumstantial. They had a missing person, a suspect who bought land in a backhoe, and a patch of chemically altered soil. There was no DNA, no direct link between the lie and Eleanor. The district attorney was hesitant to go to trial. He warned the detectives that a skilled defense attorney would tear the case apart, painting it as a series of unfortunate coincidences. They had the story, but they couldn't yet prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Harding decided it was time to confront Julian directly with their findings. They brought him back into the sterile, gray interview room. This time, Julian's composure finally showed a hairline crack. When Harding laid out the photos of the excavated land and the lab report on the lie, a flicker of something cold and dark passed through Julian's eyes. The mask slipped just for a second, revealing the predator beneath. But then it was gone, replaced by a look of bewildered offense. Julian launched into a new performance. He claimed the land was an investment, a place he and Eleanor had planned to build a retirement home. The backhoe, he explained, was to clear a small pond. He feigned ignorance about the lie, suggesting a previous owner or even illegal dumpers were responsible. He twisted every piece of evidence into a story of an idyllic future that had been stolen from him, casting himself once again as the ultimate victim. His ability to instantly construct a plausible lie was breathtaking. But he made one mistake. In his elaborate story about building a dream home, he mentioned a specific type of architecture he and Eleanor had supposedly chosen, a style with a deep foundation. It was a tiny, insignificant detail, but it was the slip Chen had been waiting for. Chen produced Eleanor's personal journal, which the police had recovered from her home. In it, she wrote extensively about her own dream home, a completely different style of architecture that required no deep foundation. It was a small contradiction, but it was a provable lie. The arrest of Julian Croft was a media sensation. the story of the charming art consultant, and the missing heiress was perfect fodder for the nightly news. The trial became the most-watched event of the year, a courtroom drama centered on a murder with no body. The prosecution, led by a tenacious DA named Maria Flores, had the monumental task of convicting a man of murder based on a financial paper trail and a chemically burned patch of dirt. The trial was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The prosecution meticulously laid out Julian's history, bringing in witnesses from his past who described his manipulative patterns. They presented the complex financial records and the forensic evidence from the land. Flores painted a picture of a cold, calculating love predator, a man who hunted vulnerable women for their wealth and discarded them when they were no longer useful. Her narrative was compelling and filled with chilling detail. Julian's defense was equally brilliant in its own way. His lawyer argued that the entire case was a fantasy, a witch hunt built on suspicion and coincidence. He portrayed Julian as a tragic figure, a man unlucky in love who was now being persecuted by an overzealous police force. He called character witnesses who described Julian as a kind, gentle, and generous man. In the courtroom, Julian himself was the perfect defendant, quiet, respectful, and looking heartbroken. He held the jury captivated. The turning point in the trial came from an unexpected source, the gardener from Eleanor's estate. He was an elderly man who had worked for her family for 40 years. On the stand, he recounted a conversation with Julian just a week before Eleanor disappeared. Julian had asked him, in a casual, offhand manner, about the best way to deal with a particularly stubborn type of weed, one that had deep roots. The gardener had recommended a powerful, industrial-grade chemical solution. The chemical he named had a lye base. This testimony was devastating. It connected Julian directly to the chemical found on his property and demonstrated premeditation. His casual conversation with the gardener was not about gardening. It was research for a murder. It was a glimpse into the chillingly practical and mundane planning that went into his monstrous act. The mask of the grieving lover was shattered, replaced by the face of a meticulous and patient killer who had planned every single detail. After a 6-week trial and 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty. Julian Croft was convicted of first-degree murder, despite the absence of a body. As the verdict was read, he showed no emotion. His face remained a placid mask, even as his life as a free man came to an end. There was no outburst, no plea for mercy, just a quiet acceptance. For a master manipulator, the final loss of control was met with an unnerving, absolute calm. Julian Croft was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. He never confessed to the murder of Eleanor Vance, nor did he ever reveal the true location of her remains. The patch of lye-soaked earth was a grave without a body, a monument to a crime that was almost perfect. The other cases from Julian's past were reopened, but without new evidence, they remained cold, the ghosts of his potential victims still crying out for a justice they would likely never receive. In the aftermath, the lives Julian had touched were left shattered. Eleanor's friends had to live with the knowledge that the man they had once welcomed into their circle was a monster. The families of the other women from Julian's past were left with the agonizing certainty of his guilt, but no legal closure. The case served as a horrifying reminder that the most dangerous predators are not always the ones who lurk in the shadows, but often the ones who stand in the spotlight, adored and admired. Detective Harding retired a year after the trial, but the Croft case stayed with him. He would often say that Julian was the only criminal who truly unnerved him, not because of the violence of his crime, a violence Harding couldn't even prove, but because of the sheer emptiness behind his eyes. He described interviewing Julian as talking to a beautifully designed mannequin, All the correct words came out, but there was nothing inside. There was no empathy, no remorse, just a cold, intellectual understanding of human emotion, which he used as a weapon. The legacy of the Julian Croft case is a chilling one. It has become a case study in law schools and psychology programs on psychopathic behavior and the prosecution of no-body murder cases. It highlights the terrifying effectiveness of masterful psychological manipulation. Julian didn't need a weapon to control his victims. His words were his tools. He built prisons of love and devotion around them from which they could not escape, proving that the most secure cage has no bars. To this day, Julian Croft maintains his innocence from his prison cell, occasionally granting interviews where he spins his tale of being a tragic, misunderstood romantic. Some people who listen to him still believe he is innocent, a testament to his enduring and terrifying power of persuasion. And it leaves us with a final, haunting question. If a monster is charming enough, and their story is told well enough, how many of us would invite them into our homes, never realizing our welcome was the key to our own disappearance?